Thank you. The first song, a lot of you knew my father, Alfred Nelson. And a lot of you, at least the people who graduated around 61, knew me from high school. That was my dad's father's favorite song, the first one. It's a Norwegian folk song called Kjæving og Staven. My dad's native language was Norwegian, so obviously he learned that at home. It's my second language. I started speaking it when I was 6 in Indiana. I was born in Rensselaer. You don't have to be only born in Europe to speak a European language or to have that as part of your self-identity. And the second one was Swedish. It's connected to the Bishop Hill settlement, the first Swedish settlement in the Midwest from the 1840s. And the verse to that song, vi sålde våra hemman och gav oss sådan ut som fågeln låt flyga när sommaren tar slut. Den kommer en gång åter när våren skrider fram, men vi får aldrig skåda vårt kära fosterland. Which I've done a translation of that. It would be like this in English. We sold our homes in Sweden and sailed away from friends, like the birds that fly to the Southland when summer sadly ends. They come again in springtime and rest upon the strand, but we will never, never again see our dear motherland. So Scandinavians didn't come to escape from brutal oppression. They came to have a better life after economic hardship, for the most part. For the most part, not entirely, but that's far and away 90% of why they came. And let's see here. This was originally planned as a two-person operation. That's why it looks like there's backfield in motion up here. Where, at the best of all possible worlds, I would be just reading from my notes, and there would be somebody else manning the controls here. But as you can see, things didn't work out that way today. Now, this is the second part of a program on Scandinavian settlements in Indiana, and the initial part gave the reasons for why people left the Scandinavian countries, Norway, Sweden, Denmark, and by extension of the Nordic countries, that's Norway, Sweden, Denmark, and Finland, and up here somewhere, Iceland. These 5 countries are the Nordic countries. And some of you were probably not. How many were not here in February for the February meeting? There were several that were not. I can do an abbreviated version of the introduction. And this first part is a good memory refresher for those of you who were here. Perhaps you did not know that there is at least 10 extant buildings in Chesterton and at least 10 more in Porter and Burns that had a Swedish past. And I'll bet you might like to know the reasons for those, so we can get to that soon. The Scandinavian immigrants contributed greatly to the formation of the Calumet region. Swedish, Norwegian, and Danish settlers came to nearly 20 Indiana counties, which we'll see a little later. But we live in the heart of the largest of their settlements, and the one that would be closest to what sociologists call an intensive settlement. We'll study tonight the intensive settlement of Westchester Township more closely. The first settlers from Denmark, Finland, Sweden, and Norway came to America starting in 1630 with the New Delaware, or New Sweden settlement that was along the Delaware River in Delaware and southeastern Pennsylvania and southwestern New Jersey. Between 1840 and 1920, over 2.3 million people came from these Nordic countries. Now, the populations then were pretty small. Norway's population might have been 2.5 million. Denmark's only slightly larger. Sweden's not a lot larger yet. They were all less than half the size they are now in population at that time. So by the time there were, 400,000 Swedes living in the States, that meant 20% of all living Swedes were living in the U.S. for a period of time. But 350,000 Danes emigrated to the States. There also were equal proportions in Canada to what there were in the States. So if you take off 1 0 off the ends of these, you'll have the numbers for Canada. Finns, 240,000. Icelanders, 20,000. Norwegians, over 800,000, and Swedes, 1.5 million. Yes. Serena?
Yes.
Do I need to activate this?
You already moved it forward.
Oh, I did, yeah. I think because Iceland is suddenly there. Iceland suddenly appeared on the map. So here are the Scandinavian countries today. You see the borders were not always what they are now. This large area here has only been part of Sweden since the 1640s. And the southernmost provinces in Sweden, including Skåne, that has the dialect that is the largest joke dialect in the country. People say, there's a sign on a building in Stockholm in a tourist area that says, "We speak English, du sprechen Deutsch, parlez-vous français?" And at the bottom it says, "Skånska inte talas här," meaning we do not speak Skåne dialect. One dialect of their whole language. All these other foreign languages are there. Suomi is the Finnish word for Finland. Then we have Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. And these are countries that were, in quotes, adopted by Norway, Sweden, and Denmark after the breakup of the Soviet Union because of their close old historic culture ties with them. So,
what was the part that you said was not Swedish until the 1600s?
Oh,
what was it?
Okay, this here is Jämtland and Härjedal, and then here we have Halling, Bleking, and Skåne down here. So
who did it belong to, though?
They belong to, these two belong to Norway first, and then these down here were part of Denmark, but they had been from the earliest times. There used to be a thick and almost impenetrable woodland with a strong undergrowth in it that ran more or less along what was the southern boundary of Sweden at the time. And then actually Bornholm over here is still Danish. Öland was Danish for a while, but Gotland has been sort of more or less Swedish most of its history. And so the terrains in these countries vary quite a bit from the one to the other. Now, why did people leave? They emigrated for many reasons. Religious persecution, Russian oppression in Finland, military conquest of part of Denmark by what was to become the German Empire down here. One of my grandmother's parents left for that reason. They were, some of her cousins that I actually met said that they showed up for school one day in the fall of 1891, and suddenly there was a teacher there who they couldn't understand because the Kaiser had issued an edict that they were that people in the newly acquired territories were to be Germanized. That was in Denmark and Western Poland at the same time. Unemployment, famines, population explosions. In Iceland, volcanic eruptions, but fortunately the other countries didn't need to worry about those. And as living conditions and medical procedures improved, there was less infant mortality, so families were more or less exploding in size, and there was too many people for cultures in which virtually everyone lived on farms or in fishing villages. But then for the social, the economic angle of it, in the 1850s, about half of the population of a given Scandinavian country were skilled craftsmen and farmers who owned their own land, half the population. Close to another half were day laborers, domestic servants, and farmers who did not own their land. Another 2% were rich landowners, civil servants, mine and factory owners, and homeless vagrant beggars were 2% of the population. These are not minorities, these are their own people. There were similar situations in each of these countries. So their parliaments, yes, they sort of had parliaments. They were made up of landowners, merchants, minor nobility who kept the other half socially and economically in their place, kept them down. And a third of the factory workers in Norway were children aged 9 to 16 in 1885, but then that was the same over here, more or less that number. Letters and rumors of America would be told of hardships and tragedy on their way over, but they also told of a vast land full of economic opportunities unknown in Europe, the hope of upward mobility, and in some cases the hope of land ownership was what drove the numbers over here. Duneland has an that's the farmer, the horse, and the plow. And this is a picture from Sweden. It's actually not from the earlier immigration. This one is from about 1916. But things had changed little because, Wisconsin and in Indiana on the farms my parents grew up on, that's the way they were farming too. Scandinavian immigrants began settling in Indiana as early as the 1830s. Most of them came by way of Chicago, Galva, and the Fox River Valley. Galva, how many people have heard of Galva, Illinois? The population today is still about 85% Swedish American. It's a town that's between Galesburg and, it's north of Galesburg at any rate, and was near Bishop Hill, which was the first Scandinavian settlement in the Midwest in 1846. By 1860, there were scattered settlements of Swedes, Norwegians, and Danes in northern and western Indiana on farms and in small towns and cities. I'll show you a map here and here. But see, here is the county map. Region is up here, and marked off in red are two areas where there were a lot of Scandinavian settlers. Now, by Scandinavians in Indiana, we will mean that 90% of the time 90% of these people were Swedes, and the rest were Danes and Norwegians in smaller numbers, but they were here definitely. White County near Monticello was the first Norwegian settlement in 1832. Around Lafayette and around Attica and Fountain County then were where some Swedes came in from Illinois. You would sort of have a counterclockwise circle that went through Chicago and then over toward Galva and then down through the Fox River Valley, Ottawa, LaSalle, Peru, Illinois. And then just south of that, there was a settlement from which people moved back and forth between Paxton, Illinois farmland and Attica, Illinois farmland for about 3 generations. They would go depending on which of those areas had the best weather for growing crops. And if they failed in the one area, they would just move back to the other area. So you had a little bit of instability there, and then you did have a lot of back and forth between Westchester Township and Chicago too at the same time. So it's not so surprising that they didn't just settle down and plant roots and stay there for good. Yes, some did, but many did not. They wanted to go where they were going to be best able to nourish themselves and their families. Now here are some farm workers from the Swedish province of Duneland. You can see here's a team of oxen and the children in the front, a lot of aprons and long dresses for the ladies. And some cases, the men would wear jackets that went down to their knees as a protection, depending on what they did for a living. And in some cases, their peasant costumes had patches of leather sewn in certain places to protect their bodies from intense heat, from things like blacksmith's fires and like that. It was all, every bit of what they wore was either for protection from the elements or from what they were working with. How many Scandinavians are there today, or people of Scandinavian descent in the States? There are 4.3 million Swedish Americans, 4.6 million Norwegian Americans, and about 1.5 million Danish Americans by extraction that have reported themselves in census. Now, getting over here was a rough go for many people. The immigrants had to provide their own food and clothing because none was provided on the boats. The voyages were often stormy, and the very first ship to sail Swedish immigrants in modern times got caught in a storm. It took it 12 weeks to get here, and by the time that they landed on the East Coast, 22% of the immigrants were dead, almost all of them children. But the survivors of that group on the Wilhelmina in 1846 were the ones then who settled at Bishop Hill, Illinois. And due to them settling there and others who came from this little place on the Baltic coast of Sweden near Gävle, which is Gavle, with dots over the A. Latin form is actually Gevalia, which I've heard called Gevalia by people who don't know, which is one heck of a good coffee brand. But they called it Galva because they figured that the Yankees could pronounce it. And thanks to them being there and others who came to what was sort of a magnet effect, that people would come. When some people came, others in their social network back home would eventually get letters. The letters might have taken a couple of months to get back and forth. But there was a very flourishing business of letter writing between Europe and the U.S., especially in the most literate parts. And there were laws passed in the Scandinavian countries in the 1700s requiring people to be able to read and write. So the children, when they were confirmed, would have had reading and writing for, in some cases, a few weeks a year up to 7 years, without there being a school necessarily, but they could read and write. So there were letters going back and forth. This was another source of information, so more of them actually knew what to expect when they got here. Let's see. Here are the traditional provinces of Sweden. Today the lines are drawn a little differently, but if you say my relatives came from this or that part of Sweden, here are the ones they would meet. Skåne and Blekinge down in the south. Halland, Bohuslän along the coast. This is all coastal around here. The only province that's actually belonged to Norway, Sweden, and Denmark. The only one. Also the one that the wooden clogs come from that were popular here in the 1970s. Dalsland, Värmland, Västergötland, Östergötland, west and east Gothland. And then we have Småland here, which contributed 10% of the immigrants and a large percentage of the ones in Porter County. Jönköpings län, Jönköping County, Kronobergs län, or Kronoberg County, and Kalmars län, Kalmar County, down here. Then up here we have Närke, Södermanland, where that picture of the farm family was from, Uppland, Gästrikland, and then there is Gävle, the town that the population of Galva traces its roots back to. Dalarna, this is the folk traditional magnet of Sweden. This is a place where the old traditional folk cultures are still alive. The painting, the artwork, the folk costumes, the fiddling, the traditional singing styles are thriving in Dalarna. Then you have Härjedal and Jämtland that were Norwegian until 300 years ago. Medelpad, Hälsingland, Ångermanland, and then the northern third of the country is Norrland. And in Norrland, the Swedish that is spoken there is spoken with sort of an inverted tone to the voice, which would make it sound a little bit more like Finnish. I've actually heard people get into fights on boats between Finland and Sweden, thinking that they were being insulted in their own language, when it turned out it was people who spoke this language on the other side and had to have someone who was trilingual from the crew to straighten the fights out. It's quite interesting but unique. Now, when they settled, when they came over, let's see, here is Connecticut was one little province in north central Sweden, I pointed out. These people had settled in, they had settled in Minnesota. And look what they built a log house because the log house tradition does go back to Norway, Sweden, and Finland. It was brought to what's now the U.S. with those Swedes and Finns that settled in New Sweden in about 1632. The thing is, they used this, coniferous trees. They got over here and found these gnarly trunked oak and maple and hickory trees and thought, oh, we're going to have to put some large, we're going to have to fill some chinks with moss or whatever we can. But they said, no, that's not the way we do it. We make sure that everything is planed, level, and even so that the air and the water do not leak in and out. In 1977, I helped a farm family dismantle a wooden store shed on their farm in Norway that they did not know the age of, but they knew it had been in the family for 10 generations. And it was just perfectly solid yet. It's just that some worms had gotten into the wood, but the carpentry was perfect. So I imagine that these were a whole lot better too than some of the non-Scandinavians were living in. If Abraham Lincoln had been Scandinavian, he might not have had that book that got wet when he stuck it in the cracks. The whole story. He might have had a really good law career in Illinois, and that was it. But that's not the way it turned out. Yes, the Bishop Hill colony. Let's see, first off, here is a map showing the upper Midwest. Most of the Scandinavians settled more or less in a diagonal line going through northern Illinois, western Wisconsin, eastern Minnesota. Actually, then it goes up like this and into the eastern quarter or so of North and South Dakota and across the northern bit of Iowa. Then you get the Danes, who were kind of down in here in eastern Nebraska and western Iowa, where you don't normally think of Scandinavian speak, but the terrain there looks a lot like Denmark. Very hilly, not too much in the way of forests, but a lot of good topsoil for farming there. And then here are some Swedish settlers in Kansas. See that by now their clothing is looking a lot the way the clothing did on other settlers at the time. And of course, they've all had a hard life. If you can imagine how hard it must have been, you can understand why they're not smiling. Well, being Scandinavian is part of it, of course. I'm not just smiling all the time, but it's culturally a non-starter. But still, it was very rough. This is Bishop Hill. This is some haying that was being done in about the only known communal settlement of Scandinavians that came to the States. After their communal leader was shot to death, they went on for a while with their sort of religious services and eventually decided to stay together, but to invite in some people representing some of the traditional religions. There was another settlement of Swedes in Scandia, Kansas, who were anti-Christianity. They wanted nothing to do with Christianity. And after the parents died off, the children rebelled and invited in Lutheran and Methodist missionaries, Christians. But that's another story. Scandia, Kansas. Look it up sometime. A boy from Chesterton got married there, and I was best man at his wedding, so I learned a lot about this some years back. Now, if we can move on to some markers from Södermanland again. And there is that map. So you see Attica, Indiana, the Lafayette area, which had the very first Swedish church in the U.S. in a little area in Indiana, in a place called Yorktown, which was actually about 5 miles from where my mother was born. And the old Swedish church in Attica is 1 year older than Augsburg, making Augsburg the second oldest Lutheran church of Swedes in the state. And it's still in operation in the same building. Augsburg is in its third building now, or thereabouts. But the original building from the 1850s is still holding services in it at 204 East Lake Street in Attica. Then we had Swedes here in Grovertown and Donaldson. And they built a church between the two towns. And as there were more Swedes in the one town, they picked up the church, put it on a wagon, and took it to that town 4 miles away. That was Donaldson. So Grovertown lost its church because there were more Swedes in Donaldson. And that church is still operating too. Here was a photo that I was happy to find. It's the Hillstrom Organ Factory. The Hillstrom Organ Factory was, what building is there today? Does anybody happen to know what building is on the lot that this used to be on?
What used to be the post office?
The post office that was built in 1960.
Yeah.
I remember playing in the high school band for the dedication. I wish they hadn't picked late November. It's kind of freezing. But it was the northwest corner of the intersection of 4th Street and Broadway was where the Hillstrom organ factory was built. In 1879 was when they started operation. And if you continued north, of course, you'd run into the railroad tracks. There were railroad tracks there before there was a town. So what they would do is they would build these organs in a wooden cabinet at the exterior of the instrument itself. Then they would crate them, and they would roll them right straight onto the boxcars on the trains out the back door. And many of them went to Swedish missions around the world because there were a few different places in the Middle East and Africa that Swedish missionaries had gone, and a lot of Hillstrom organs went there, others around within the U.S. We've got several right here in Chesterton that are, some are in excellent working order. The one at the museum is a fine example. Now here is a picture of Mr. Hillstrom, Carl Oskar Hillstrom himself. He was born in Sweden in, 1836. He died in 1896, the year after this picture was taken. And in the second row, here we have Charles Holm and Otto Kjellberg, and then Mr. Hillstrom is here. I'll get back to them in a minute, to these two workers here, but he looks like a very tired and broken man, and he was by this time at the age of 59, because within a very short period of time, his two sons both died tragic deaths, very young. One was killed by a train, and another one took down with a terrible illness and was dead within a few days of that. And it was a terrible loss to the Hillstrom family. But these fellows were either immigrants from Sweden or they were second-generation Swedish Americans. Some of them were skilled craftsmen that worked with the tuning of the reeds in the instruments. Others were good at doing, chip carving for the deep relief ornamentations on the bodies of the instrument. And then they would have a person who was skilled at making the musical parts inside. And most of the time they had somewhere around 15 or 16 employees, but at one point I think they had as many as 25. There were, of course, this was a small factory, but still it was a very unique factory, and a significant number of people were employed in it. And in about that same year, that picture was taken, 1895, maybe a little before. Does anybody recognize where this house is?
Yes.
Where is it, John?
Isn't that at the corner of Porter Avenue and
Yeah, this is quartered here, and then what's the, Fourth, that's right, Fourth Street. It's because you live at the other corner of the same
Yes, I
block.
live at the other corner.
There are 6 houses here that now are not looking quite as nice as they did 50 years ago. This one is in excellent shape, but if you look at the fronts, the gables on all 6 are identical. It was 6 houses were built for Hillstrom Organ Factory employees.
Yeah.
And they're all still there. So that's 6 of your roughly 10 plus buildings built by or for Swedes in Chesterton. Now, this shows a wagon load of people who are leaving to go to a ship and leave for the new country. The Reverend Eric Norelius and his wife came to Attica, Indiana, and when this new congregation was founded there, they were there for 8 years, and then went on to another Swedish congregation. They had just gotten married and were headed for the ship, and they knew it. I think that's why they look a little scared in the picture. I'm sure things improved once they got to their new calling. And there's a picture of that church I told you about in Attica. That is the old Swedish Lutheran church there. And there's some pictures from Småland, stone cutters. Many stone cutters and people with skilled trades like that came to the States and found work as we were getting, say, Bedford Stone in southern Indiana and other stone quarries in Fountain County. And of course, this was what drew most of the Scandinavians was farmland. It didn't look like home, but you could grow crops in it without having to move 50-ton rocks out of the way with wooden crowbars. And then this is one of the beautiful towns they came from. Today, of course, things have changed a whole lot in Sweden. The Scandinavian immigration quotas are never filled. They have to the U.S. There are not nearly that many people interested in coming over, except to visit anymore. They don't need to come for economic reasons. And there's that Swedish church that was moved with a team of horses and a wagon from Grovertown to Donaldson. And then this is a confirmation class at that church. And the second girl in the front row, Edna Carlson, had a boyfriend, and he got a job before they came over. He got a job in Des Moines, saved his money up, and wrote to her, and eventually they got together and moved to some other place. But they are examples of the change in immigration from families to individual young people after about 1880. Because it was maybe generations of families at first. That's the old Danish Lutheran Church in Indianapolis, for those who didn't know there was one. And this one is the closest thing we have to a stave church. It's in Marshfield, Indiana. Why, I do not know. There's another group of immigrants that are leaving, heading off on their trip. Yes, Joseph Bailey's original trading post. Bailey's son-in-law, Wicker, there are 2 Wicker brothers, and one of them noticed that these Swedish workers in Chicago were very adroit at working wood, and he encouraged a group of them to come down and work in his sawmill and at cutting logs in this deciduous forest that there was right through here. And that was the start of the Swedish settlement here. Here's what one of his operations might have looked like. And there, of course, is still some forest left, but it just stretched and stretched from Illinois to Michigan. And then this is Alan Carlson, who we have to thank for the organization of religion here. Since there were no political or cultural leaders, the clergy were the ones who were the community leaders where there were Scandinavians settled. He came to the Porter Baileytown area and found that he thought they were a very godless group that really should have a church. And he persuaded them to start a congregation that eventually became Augsburg Lutheran Church in 1959. Carlson Hall on the Augustana College campus, where I lived for 3 of my 4 years. It was originally named for him. Then they renamed it after a Ms. Carlson, so it went from being Carlson Hall to Carlson Hall, but named for a woman rather than a man. I was trying to figure the logic on that, since they should have had her first name in there as well, but nice looking building. And then there we have the Bergstrom Chapel, Svenska skolan. Originally, the cemetery back here has some of the original settlers from the 1850s buried there. And in one short period of time, there were 5 deaths, and the cemetery was growing rapidly, and the new congregation wanted a chapel closer to the cemetery, and Frederick Bergstrom gave them a tool shed, and a tower was built on one end of it, and it was put up there. And until about 1924, it was, among other things, used as a school. And the parents of several of my schoolmates had their book learning in Swedish done in this building. There's the interior. And there's a Hillstrom organ over here. It seats these. I think there's seating for about 16 people at these desks. And then here is the cemetery itself. There are 207 graves in there. And then this is Johan Alfred Jonsson's tombstone. His wife lived many years beyond him, but when they put the stone up, she put in here his full name, when he was born, and not only the province, but the parish and the farm he was born on, all this. So when she died, what they had room for was her first name and the year she was born and died. But she really cared enough about him to put that on there, didn't think we're running out of room. And then there is the same picture of the Hillstrom Organ Factory again, and the house on 4th Street. If I just went through sheer names of people here, we could have started at 6 and I'd still be going to show you some of the connections between people then and now. Frederick Bergstrom, who built the shed that became the Svenska skolan, was born in 1826 in Sweden. He died in 1896 over here. His brother-in-law, August Bistrand, was another Swedish immigrant, came to Bailey Town. Married, his daughter, Anna Bistrand, married Victor Charlson. Victor Charlson and Anna Bistrand had 7 children. Alvin Charlson, Marion Charlson, who married Ivar Edquist.
Yeah.
Edith, who married George Martinson. Elvira, or Elvira, who married Roy K. Peterson and Dr. Vernon Charlson. Ivar Edquist was the son of Reverend Bertil Edquist, and the father of Cynthia Edquist, who Irene and I were in school with, and Tom and several others. Edith and George Martinson were the parents of Ronald and Dennis Martinson. Martinson Cabinet Shop was opened by George and his son Ronald. Dennis Martinson was in school with me. And Denny and I were in band together. And we had a dance band that consisted of Jim Tunn, John Mullen, Ted Arndt, Terry Onis, Wilton Slater, and Brian Wallen, and us. Ted Arndt's mother was from Sweden. Terry Onis' father was from Norway. Weldon and Brian were cousins whose grandparents came from Sweden on their mother's side. So we almost had a Scandinavian clean sweep there of our dance band from high school. I've got one more little set of pictures to show you that have buildings in them from our area. Augsburg, where I was confirmed. This is a beautiful building for those of you who haven't seen it or been in it. There's the sanctuary. Built in the 1930s, the present building. And the cemetery. The gravestone of Anders and Ludvig Kjellberg. If any of you see that beautiful table at the Red Cup with Chelberg Farm on it, notice the B-U-R-G instead of B-E-R-G. It's a misspelling. It's supposed to be B-E-R-G. B-U-R-G is German. It is not Scandinavian. Bethlehem Lutheran Church was an offshoot of Augsburg congregation as Swedes gradually moved further south into the county. And of course, there's a new building, but this is the original building is still there. This little building is at 219 Jefferson. It's Jefferson and West between 2nd and 3rd Streets. If you imagine it with a steeple here instead of this front porch, it was the old Swedish Methodist church before they built the brick one. When they got the money for the brick church and a larger congregation, they stripped it down and sold it as a house, and it was moved with a horse and wagon from the site of what we now know as the old Christian Science Church next to Bethlehem to this spot. I don't know if the people that live there now have any idea that it used to be a Swedish Methodist church and that it's 115 years old. And there is the old Swedish Methodist until 1947, when the Swedish Methodist Synod in the U.S. Disbanded, and they merged with what my grandma would have called the Yankee Church, which would be the larger Methodist church. Hjalmar Carlson, H.F. Carlson, I was lucky enough to hear him sing one of the last times that he sang a solo at the Methodist Church. His business was where it was Spike and Buddy's store now is.
Yeah.
Well, that was his grocery store at that point. He was an immigrant from Småland too. And this was his sister and her husband, the grandparents of one of my old school friends from Brook, Indiana. And Lundberg, what was extremely unique about John Lundberg being an undertaker? What was unique about it? He was Indiana's first licensed undertaker.
Yeah.
Swedish immigrant, and
That's right.
a cabinet maker who turned to a furniture maker. Now,
He was a very nice man, I want to add.
thank you, John. That's good to hear. It's always nice to hear good things about these people. And I've got one last thing here I want to do. It's concluding a little bit about the Scandinavian cultural identity problem by an immigrant author and a vice president of the United States. Willie Rådvåg, a college professor and an immigrant, wrote this thing talking about having one foot firmly planted on each side of the ocean. I have heard glowing speeches here in America espousing local pride because the places in question were financially advantageous and promising. But after 26 years in America, I still haven't heard speeches that talk of love of a place as a good home for those same people and for future generations. We are judged by our abilities to boost. And he put boost into the Norwegian because there was no Norwegian word for it. We rack our brains trying to come up, this is my translation. We rack our brains trying to come up with catchy slogans for the places we live. With these, we're supposed to win two things, local pride and commercial advertising, preferably the latter. The one requirement which alone can make people happy with a place, namely love, is not spoken of. Indeed, how can we conceive of such a thing as love of place here where everything is for sale? We haven't many true homes in the upper Midwest, and this is part of our spiritual poverty. We have money, a sense of material well-being and riches, but few true homes. One can buy a place to live. A home, on the other hand, is something you build or inherit, cherish, and love. He wrote that in 1920.
Yeah.
And then, this is by Charles Fairbanks, that Fairbanks, Alaska is named for. It's shorter. In support of hyphenated cultural identity, our danger is not so much from the man who loves two countries as the man who loves none. In 99 cases out of 100, the man who has a lingering affection for the fatherland, no matter where his fatherland may be, is a true nationalist and patriot. It is the man who believes that his own passions and his own desires are superior to those of the state, who would destroy nationalism just as he would destroy the family, who is the real menace to the nation. Here, and not with the one who with whom would clasp hands across the sea. We find a man who is to be watched as a possible danger to the bosom of America. That was written in 1908. Talk for mine? That's thanks for me. Any questions? In 1880, over 50% of the people in Westchester Township were either born in Sweden or were the children of Swedish parents. So you figure then they still kept coming over until 1924, that they have far and away been the largest ethnic group here and almost a plurality ever since before 1880. And the first jobs they were farmers, then they were bricklayers, or people who worked in the brickyards in Porter. And then by 1930, the single largest employer is the steel mills. So there were transitions there, but the same names then start coming up, only more numerous than there had been before. Gustafsons, Håkansons, Petersons, Swansons, Nelsons for that matter, Petersons, Pearson, which is related to Peterson, Lawrence, which is an anglicizing of Larson, Lawson, which is another anglicizing of Larson. And then there was Skog, which turned out to be high wood. And let's see, what was the other one? There was a fellow who was told by a Yankee, "What's your Swedish name?" And he wrote it out, and the guy didn't see the dots on the L. Of course, he wouldn't have known what that was. Said, "Hogberg, that means pig in English." So the guy changed his last name to Droughty. And I'm sure he just wanted something that was as far as possible from it. But there are just all these little anecdotes about the path to becoming American that you could fill volumes with. Thanks again. And wait, there's two.
Would it be appropriate if I request that you sing that song, I Left My Home in Sweden?
Vi sålde våra hemman och gav oss sådde han ut som fågeln bör flyga där sommaren tar slut. Han kommer en gång åter när våren skrider fram. Men vi får aldrig skåda vårt kära fosterland.